Tiz, a vulnerable young Brazilian girl, finds herself speeding through the night towards the lights of a big city. Her companion is a man who has promised her parents that he will find their daughter work as a maid. What awaits her there is something different, however, and her life becomes increasingly fraught with danger, both mental and physical.
Interwoven into this tragic and violent storyline is the account of a young doctor whose life and love affair in the south of England are in stark contrast to the dangerous, sexually abusive situation in which Tiz finds herself. Yet their stories and that of their families become closely linked. You are listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight by Deborah Varon. Part 3. Family Delight.
Tiz, a young girl from a deprived village in Brazil, is delighted when her baby brother Davi is born. She is not so happy, however, when her best friend Yara goes to the city to work. Sadly, Davi falls ill, and his father Carlos takes him to the doctor.
All was quiet in Tiz's village. The moon painted the little settlement in a silvery glow, giving it a temporary beauty that was lacking in the all-too-revealing brightness of day. Little lights shone from most of the shacks as weary workers gratefully enjoyed a few hours of respite from the daily grind of survival. But there was also a vulnerability about this seemingly peaceful scene, a helplessness much relished by the stranger who moved quietly in the darkest shadows, peering in at the illuminated, uncurtained windows. He saw a great deal which delighted him. Yes, there were several young girls here, and one or two of them would be attractive if they had more flesh on their bodies. He smiled to himself and thought of the money they would bring him and all it could buy. Then he tiptoed away and laid his plans. A few months after Tiz's trip to the sea, mother and daughter were seated at the table talking by the light of a single candle. The beads had been put to one side and lay heaped in little sparkling mounds of blue, vermilion and gold.
"How long is it before the baby comes?" asked Tiz for the 100th time that month. "Oh, Tiz, I'm not sure," replied her mother, "but I don't think it can be long now. I'm so huge," and she rubbed her stomach wearily. Tiz hugged herself as she thought how lovely it was going to be to have a baby in the house. "I do so wish he'd hurry up," she said. "You keep saying he," replied her mother, "but we won't know for sure whether it's going to be a boy or a girl until the baby comes. Don't be disappointed if it's a girl." Tiz, who was quite sure the baby was going to be a boy, smiled a little secret smile and went to bed, where she burrowed down under her old blankets and soon fell asleep. In the early hours of the morning, the house came alive again to the sound of footsteps and quiet voices. A little later, a thin wailing pierced the silence and then ceased, but still Tiz slept on.
Morning came, and the moon's fierce brother, the sun, shone. He had no sentimental desire to make the village appear romantic, as the moon had done, and it was revealed in all its stark deprivation. Tiz slept late, as her mother failed to call her as she usually did. When she eventually woke, she sat up and rubbed her eyes, noticing how high the sun was.
"What's happening? Why hasn't Mamai woken me?" she thought. In alarm, she jumped out of bed and hurried into Anna's room, where, to her utter astonishment, she found her mother was fast asleep. Opening her mouth to call to her, the words died on her lips as her eye fell on a tiny baby nestling in a large cardboard box. Tiz gazed down at the small face and thought she had never seen anything so beautiful.
The baby, who was sleeping in a very determined manner, had one little hand resting on the cotton wrap that swaddled him, and Tiz gazed at it enchanted. As she peered closer, she saw with delight the fringe of delicate pink nails that adorned the miniature finger ends. Reaching out, she gently touched the tiny hand, and to her great joy, the baby opened its eyes and seemed to look at her. Then the delicate blue-veined lids fluttered closed again. Gradually, she became aware that she was being watched, and turning her head, she saw that her mother had woken up.
"Lovely, isn't he?" said Anna in a soft, tired voice. "He's beautiful," breathed Tiz. "My baby brother, at last. Can I hold him?" At that moment the baby stirred and opened his eyes again. He moved his head, and Tiz, not waiting for her mother's consent, gathered him up in her arms and gently hugged him to her. As she bent her head forward, her long hair fell round his face, so that for a moment brother and sister were alone in a small secret place of their own. In that instant, Tiz felt as if she'd been looking forward to this moment all her life. "You're my baby brother," she murmured softly. "I'm your big sister, Tiz, and I'm going to look after you always." "What's his name?" she asked Anna, for her mother had refused to tell Tiz what name she had chosen for the baby, in case it brought bad luck. "Well, call him Davy," replied Anna. "Davy," whispered Tiz. "Davy. Yes, I like that." Gently she gave the baby to her mother and gazed enraptured as he took his first meal.
Yara and Tiz were sitting talking on the step in front of Tiz's house. Davy, now 3, was squatting at their feet. Earlier in the day, the girls had accidentally slopped some water on the ground when they were carrying the water bucket, so that the dirt was wet and Davy was amusing himself playing with it.
"What are you trying to do?" queried Tiz. "Do you want me to help you?" And she looked with interest at the tiny mound of mud Davy was patting with his small hands.
"Our house," replied Davy carefully. "Come help me, Tiz," he went on. Tiz glanced at her friend, who seemed to be preoccupied, wondering whether she would mind her helping Davy. She knew that Yara didn't like playing with him, so hesitated before suggesting they both join in the game.
"What are you thinking, Yara?" she queried. "You're daydreaming about something, aren't you?" "I'm dreaming about being rich," replied Yara, a faraway look in her eyes. "Do you remember the beautiful lady in the car who gave us the chocolate ages ago? She was wearing that lovely yellow dress." "Yes, I do," replied Tiz. "There was a grumpy old man and a boy who was reading a book too, wasn't there?" "Well," said Yara, "I'd like to be like her. I want to wear lovely clothes and drive about in a big car like she did. I also want to eat chocolate every day, lots of it." "But what about me?" queried Tiz. "If you did those things, you would have to go away. And what should I do without you?" "You've got Davy now," replied Yara, shrugging her shoulders, and with that she got up and walked away down the village street. "Oh, Davy," murmured Tiz, "why isn't Yara like she used to be? Ever since you were born she's been jealous of you. But she mustn't go away," she added anxiously. "I would miss her so."
Watching Yara go, she thought sadly that for the last 2 or 3 weeks, Yara had been behaving oddly. She'd seemed withdrawn and uncommunicative. Tiz had come across her several times sitting on the step outside her house, lost in her own thoughts. When Tiz had asked her what she was thinking about, Yara had snapped,
"Nothing," and got up and walked away. "What have I done?" Tiz asked herself for the umpteenth time. "She doesn't seem to want to be my friend any more. We've shared everything, and now she'll hardly talk to me." And a sense of desolate bereavement swept over her.
"Tiz, play," commanded Davy, totally unaware of his sister's sadness. Tiz got up from the step and squatted down beside him in the mud. Davy had given up trying to make a house and was now patting the mud with his little hands, trying to make it level. He then picked up a nearby twig and poked a hole in the smooth patch, and then another a small distance away from the first. After some thought, he placed another hole under the first two and sat back to admire them.
"Give me the stick, Davy, I've an idea," ordered Tiz as she took the twig from him. Carefully, she drew a circle round each of the top two holes. She then added a downward-facing semicircle over each, and lastly an upward curve under the lower hole. "Davy," she said, pointing first at the face in the dirt and then at her brother's eyes, nose and mouth. At first Davy didn't understand, but suddenly the face in the dirt made sense to him, and he chuckled delightedly. Tiz laughed too. Brother and sister were so wrapped up in the joy of each other's company that they didn't see Yara stop, turn round, and look back at them with painful longing.
That night, Tiz was in bed and asleep. In the early hours of the morning, however, a sound woke her, and she sat up, wondering what it was.
"What's happening? What woke me?" she questioned, looking round the silent living room. Then she heard a noise from Yara's house next door. Quickly she got out of bed, padded over to the window and looked out. Dawn was just beginning to break, and in the dim light Tiz made out the dark shape of a small truck parked outside.
As she watched, the door opened and Yara came out, accompanied by the shadowy figure of a man. He opened the door of the pickup and turned the headlights on. Yara scrambled in, and he then went round to the back of the truck, put something in, and got into the driving seat. As he did so, the light from the headlamps threw his shadow over Tiz's window. She shivered as the darkness fell on her face, and a sense of dread wrapped itself around her heart as she stumbled back to bed.
"What a horrible dream," she said to herself, closing her eyes again. However, when she went to call for Yara in the morning, she found that it hadn't been a dream at all. "She's gone to Beleza to be a maid," Yara's mother informed Tiz sadly. "I shall miss her, but she would go. The money will be good, though," she added, brightening a little. "And she never even said goodbye," mourned Tiz to Davy. "How could she go like that? She was my best friend. Shall I ever see her again?" Davy, who didn't really understand what was upsetting Tiz, lifted a small hand and with his index finger traced the track a tear had made on her cheek.
"Davy, love you," he chirruped, and gathering him in her arms, Tiz buried her face in his warm neck and hugged him.
"I love you too, Davy," she replied softly.
A couple of years later, Carlos was sitting on the front steps of his shack, surrounded by a tangle of wire, which he was industriously bending and twisting with a pair of old, half-broken wire cutters. Both children were leaning over him, watching intently. Davy, now 5 years old, and small for his age, had grown into a quiet, wistful child who idolized his big sister and followed her everywhere.
"Papai," said Tiz, struggling in vain to bend a small length of wire with her fingers. "How long before you get another job? Mamai says the sugar cane crop has failed. They'll take you back in a couple of months, though, won't they?" she added in a worried voice.
"I doubt it, but we can't wait that long anyway," replied her father. "I've just got to find something else to do." "But what?" he added in a voice made sharp by his desperation.
"But Mamai and I can keep us going with the beads," said Tiz. "Won't that be enough?"
"No," snapped her father with uncharacteristic abruptness. "How long before my car is ready, Papai?" asked Davy for the umpteenth time, oblivious to the looming family crisis. "Have patience, little one," murmured Carlos, looking up. "This car is going to be a masterpiece, and masterpieces take time." and he recommenced his bending and cutting, glad to have something to take his mind off the anxiety that gnawed inside him like a cancer. Gradually, as the children watched, a shape began to emerge from the tangle. First a body, then some wheels, and a windscreen were skillfully added, until at last there it was, a small toy car fashioned entirely out of bent wire. Its little wire wheels even revolved, such was the skill of its creator. "Go and see if your mother has a piece of string, Tiz," said Carlos, "and then we'll see this wonderful car set out in its travels."
Tiz skipped into the house and came back triumphantly waving a length of twine. One end was fixed round the front bumper, and the small car was set down in the dust at the foot of the steps. Davy looked at it in awe. His eyes were round, and he stood very still, gazing at the little vehicle resting on the dusty road. He'd never had a toy of any sort before, so this was an amazing new experience for him. Indeed, he was not even sure whether he was allowed to touch something so rare and precious.
"Take the string, son," said Carlos, gently putting it into his hand. Davy gave an experimental tug, and the wire car moved a few inches along the road, making him squeal with delight. Anna heard the noise and came to stand at the top of the steps, looking with interest at the little group around the toy.
"That's a really fine car, Carlos," she said, laughing. "Does it really go?"
"Yes, it does," replied Carlos proudly. "It's the best car in the world."
"Come on, Davy, let's take it for a ride,"
encouraged Tiz, and the two set off up the dusty track which wound its way between the neighbouring shacks, gaining confidence at every step. The little car trundled after them, and they gradually picked up speed until they were both running. Turning round at the top of the street, they came dashing back again, kicking up the dust, laughing and shouting. All went well until they were near their home, when the car bumped over a stone, rose a little way into the air, and fell onto its side. Davy came to an abrupt halt, lost his balance, and sat down hard on the road. Then, as Carlos and Anna watched, he began to cough, clutching his chest and bending over, trying desperately to stop the spasms that racked his scrawny little frame. Immediately, Anna ran to him, picked him up, still coughing, and brought him back into the house.
"Fetch some water, Tiz," she commanded. Tiz ran quickly to the bucket beside the stove, filled a mug, and brought it back to her mother. Gradually, as Anna soothed him, the coughing fit subsided, and he lay exhausted on her lap. Carlos looked at his wife in consternation.
"How long has he had this cough, Anna?" he asked in a voice sharp with concern.
"About 6 months, Carlos," said Anna sadly. "I keep hoping he's going to grow out of it, but it gets worse and worse. He needs a doctor, but how can we afford that?"
As I came through Oliveira on my way home with Manolo, we stopped to get a drink there, and I heard that the government had just opened a clinic in the town, where the consultation is free, replied Carlos thoughtfully. "I don't think the treatment is free, but if we go, at least we shall know what's wrong with him."
"But how would you get him there?" asked Anna worriedly. "That's about 20 kilometres away."
"Walk," retorted Carlos tersely, "and if necessary, I'll carry him." So the next day at dawn, father and son made their way up the village street, carrying a little rice in a plastic box, an old blanket and a bottle of water. As they disappeared out of sight, Tiz turned anxiously to her mother.
"Do you think they'll be all right? I should have gone too, to help carry Davy when he gets tired." "I need you here," replied Anna, running her hand distractedly through her hair. "We must get on with the beads. It's all we have to live on now. I don't know how I'm going to stretch the food to feed 4 of us." As dusk began to fall, Carlos and Davi reached the outskirts of Oliveira. Both were weary beyond imagining, and too late for the clinic that day.
"We'd better find out where it is and then camp outside it for the night," thought Carlos to himself. "At least we'll be first then when it opens in the morning." "Hi there," he called to a man on the other side of the road who was carrying a bucket of water. "Can you tell me how to get to the new clinic, please?" "Go straight on until you reach the town centre," replied the man in a surly voice. "You can't miss it." Davi, meanwhile, had collapsed at Carlos's feet, too tired even to stand. Calling on his last reserve of energy, his father picked him up and, with several rests, made his way to the town centre where, next to a food store, he found a small, dingy, one-roomed building with a small sign on the wall saying "Clinic" in red capital letters. He set his son gently on his feet and looked about him for a sheltered place to make camp for the night.
A few yards down the road, a group of youths had gathered and were chatting and drinking. Several young women were lounging about the group, drawn to their company like moths to a candle, their shrill laughter clearly audible above the sound of the traffic. The town centre was thronged with people going home for the night, and Carlos knew that it was only a matter of time before some of them would come back onto the streets, looking for something to do for the evening.
"We can't sleep here," he thought worriedly. "It's too dangerous. But where can we go that's safe?" Leaving his son standing forlornly by the clinic door like an abandoned refugee, he walked round to the back of the building, where he found to his delight that there was a yard. "We'll sleep here," he said to himself, going back to the street where he'd left Davi.
The child was now slumped on the ground in a tired heap, so Carlos picked him up in his arms again and carried him. Just as they arrived at the open doorway, a sudden gust of wind blew into the yard, and the paper and plastic bags that littered the floor eddied round the small space. An empty Coke bottle clattered towards them with an irritating, desiccated sound, only stopping when it reached Carlos's feet.
"This isn't good," Carlos thought, "but it's the best I can find, so it will have to do." And looking round for the cleanest corner, he gently put his little son down on their blanket. Davy lay there, too tired even to sit up. Carlos knelt beside him. "Would you like some rice, Davy?" he asked gently. "Yes, please, Papai," replied the boy in a small, tired voice. Putting his arm around the child's shoulders, Carlos helped him to sit up and eat a little of the rice they had brought. However, as he silently spooned the food into his son's mouth, he asked himself the question he had asked so many times before. Why, even though I work every hour there is in the day, can't I make enough money to feed my family? No answer came, only silence. "There never is an answer," he muttered angrily to himself. When David had finished eating, his father gave him some water, and after drinking some himself, looked at the meagre amount of rice left in the plastic box. "I'd better leave the rest for Davy," he sighed with regret.
So, trying to ignore the griping hunger pains in his belly, he lay down on the blanket, took Davy in his arms and endeavoured to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come, as the ground was hard and uneven, and his mind full of dark, anxious thoughts. Presently, the noise of shouting and the sound of running feet on the road outside the yard made him fear for their safety. So, abandoning all thoughts of sleep, he opened his eyes and watched the stars come out instead. As night fell, the sky became inky black, and each star shone down on him, cold, distant, and remote. He could even see the pale smudge of the Milky Way forming a long ghostly arch across the heavens, and as he gazed up at it, despair gripped his heart. Finally, when all became quiet in the town, he fell asleep. The next morning, Carlos woke feeling dirty.
"Where am I?" he said out loud as he sat up shaking his head. "I'm so hungry," was his next thought, but there wasn't enough food for them both. Davy, however, seemed to have revived a little and sat up on the blanket to eat a little more of their precious rice. "We'll go and sit on the clinic steps now," Carlos said to him when he'd finished eating. So, gathering up their meagre possessions, father and son made their way to the front of the building. "Now we shall be the first in the queue when it opens," said Carlos as they sat down. Very soon a line of patients began to form behind them, and in no time at all it had wound its way right round the building. "It did us some good sleeping here the night," Carlos murmured to Davy. "We can start straight back as soon as the doctor has seen us." At last the door of the clinic opened, and the nurse motioned to them to come inside.
As they stepped gingerly into the clinic's single room, they could see a white-coated doctor busily typing on a laptop. He made no move to speak to them, so the nurse seated Carlos and Davy on 2 chairs facing him. They waited. Davy sat very still, legs dangling, as he looked around the unfamiliar objects in the room with large, frightened eyes. After a few moments, the doctor stopped typing and looked at them unsmilingly.
"What can I do for you?" he inquired in a businesslike tone, and Carlos explained about Davy's cough. "Weigh the boy, nurse, please," commanded the doctor. Davy was picked up and placed on the scales, where he stood trembling with fear. The doctor looked grave when he saw what the scales had registered, but made no comment. "Come to me, child," he commanded in a brisk voice. Davy, however, was petrified by the stranger in the white coat. So instead of obeying, he jumped off the scales and ran over to Carlos, clutching at his father's knees in terror. "Do as he says," ordered Carlos. Slowly, and with great reluctance, the scrawny child made his way hesitatingly to the doctor. "Lift his shirt, nurse," commanded the doctor, and proceeded to sound the boy's chest with his stethoscope, while the nurse stood behind him. "Now the back," he ordered, and Davy found himself turned around with his face pressed against the nurse, while she held up his shirt.
He could smell the scent of her clean uniform and stood shaking with fright as the cold metal end of the stethoscope prodded his bony ribs. As soon as the doctor had finished, Davy ran back to Carlos and buried his face in his father's lap. The doctor turned back to his laptop and typed away for what seemed an eternity. He then looked up wearily and addressed Carlos.
You have been listening to Tis from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight.
You may find more information by searching the web for The Garden of Sparkling Delight.
Soaring to the skies with the wind in your hair, a safe place only you can hide, trusting in those to keep you safe from harm. No hope tomorrow, nowhere to run, wondering how your life could be so cruel, just like the other.